my friend Troy to help facilitate. Troy just graduated from Moody as well. He's been a part of my radio show, starting the bridge with me and going through all the same struggles that I've gone through at Moody. And I just want to bring him up to help facilitate the conversation. No worries.
Oh, good morning, guys. Good morning. Wow. What a beautiful day, huh? Isn't it good to be here? It's beautiful. Well, I am Troy Medlin. I just graduated from Moody in Chicago last May, and have been on a similar journey as Brandon, and kind of learning, yeah, amen. And really seeing this journey as a journey into a more beautiful type of Christianity, and learning that, you know, so often the stories we tell ourselves, the gospel we tell ourselves, the narratives we have running through our heads and in our churches are really just a glimpse of what's really there, and there's really beautiful stories and beautiful narrative, and the gospel really is good news, and it's really, really beautiful, and give my life to that, to telling the more beautiful story. And I think in that sense, if evangelicalism is telling the more beautiful story, then it's worth saving, but it's been less than beautiful, but I think we can reclaim that, the beautiful story.
Yep. I guess as you're talking about evangelical, I really haven't gotten maybe there isn't a clear definition. Yeah. What is your definition?
Yeah, so there's the historical classic definition by historian David Bevington, that an evangelical is crucicentric, which about the cross, Bible-centered, activism-centered, and there's a fourth point. So there's a historical definition. Conversionism, so centered on the born-again experience. That's really not what evangelicalism is today. If you say the word evangelical, if you Google evangelical, what's going to come up are the Gospel Coalition, Neo-Reformed movement. So evangelicalism today is really synonymous with a fundamentalistic, Reformed Christianity. Even the National Association of Evangelicals, the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, all of these people are very conservative, Reformed people, and they've kind of taken the name evangelical.
I noticed you didn't say Jesus-centered.
Yeah, that's true. And this has been, even when I was part of the Gospel Coalition movement, it has always struck me that we've been about this thing called the gospel, which for them means penal substitutionary atonement, instead of being about Christ, His life, His teachings, following His way. But, yeah.
Well, when you talk about evangelicalism sinking, what comes to my mind is, because I've been working through all of this too, and I see God's fingerprints in all over the place working on this in people. I think of evangelicalism with a capital E and then with a little e. And the capital E evangelicalism is the subculture. All the extra baggage, all the extra pillars that came in that are beyond God.
Yeah.
Everybody's idea of what it means to be a God in person got blown down there and sort of calcified, and if you're not part of that, you can't be part of the club.
Yeah.
Well, I've left the club.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my faith is stronger.
Yeah.
You know, I'm closer to Jesus as a result, but I see that all that calcification is detrimental to the cause of Christ.
Absolutely.
It is a barrier to people who see Jesus as the solution to their stuff. And we've all got stuff.
Yeah.
Even when we're in the club.
Yeah.
We've all got our stuff. And so I don't think that the subculture should be saved.
Yeah.
I think the subculture should be allowed to sing. But the person behind it, the truth, is a person.
Yeah.
The truth is Jesus.
Yeah. And that's the thing, and I resonate with that completely, and that's why I think that there will be a number of new emerging movements, because I think like even at Moody, if you were to go to Moody, yes, most of my peers are going to affirm very conservative political, social, and theological doctrines, but all of us are keenly aware that this subculture is not the way of Jesus. All of us are keenly aware that Jesus has gotten lost under the baggage. So even the people who are still really devoted to the Republican agenda as a Christian evangelical value are still seeking to reclaim Jesus out of that. And so just all that to say, I definitely think that the subculture has to die. It needs to die, because the message we're projecting to the world as people of good news is far from good news. And when we leave that message, our faith gets stronger, which has been my experience as well. And recovering the gospel in Jesus, it's been life-changing. So, yeah.
So for right now, what's the difference between fundamentalism and evangelicalism?
Not a difference at all. I honestly don't. And I want to be careful, because there are people here, so I still consider I consider myself an evangelical. There's inclusive evangelicals down there. Rob Bell still considers himself an evangelical. So there's a wide range with the word, but the actual movement itself, really, John MacArthur, who was a leading fundamentalist, is now a leading evangelical. There's no difference in the movement itself. So.
Is it like Bob Jones University? Where's that fit?
Yeah. I think that they would consider themselves evangelical.
What would they consider? Moody?
They still think we're a little bit liberal. yeah. Moody just changed his policy for professors can now drink and gamble at Moody. Students can't, so Moody's definitely long gone. But
but drink and gamble aren't the issues as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I just think that if people are actually faced with the question, do you really think God's agenda is to spend less money on the poor and more on the military? I can't imagine anybody would say, yeah, that's God's agenda. And so I just think somehow there's a way to pull Jesus into this that makes them aware of that.
Yeah.
Now, my conversation with you yesterday, in which you suggested that Moody's understanding of Jesus even is that his teaching came before his crucifixion, and therefore grace hadn't yet happened, and therefore Paul is really what we look to, and that kind of scared me.
Yeah, and I'll just, let me recap that.
To say that that's actually their theological position, I knew that's kind of how, I knew Jesus was being sidelined.
Yeah.
I didn't know it was actually a theological position, sidelining.
That there's a prominent theological position, predominantly coming out of Neo-Reformed Christianity, that says that because the New Covenant's not initiated until Jesus dies on the cross, so all of Jesus' teachings are Old Covenant teachings. He's giving us law and putting on law that we can't actually live up to. And so once the cross takes place, it's all grace. And so you hear a lot of preachers in the Gospel Coalition movement say things like, Jesus fed the poor so that we don't have to. That's not our burden anymore. And those churches still engage at some level in justice, but they have no real motivation because they're more Paul Christians, worried about the theology instead of the social justice aspect of Christ himself. So yeah.
Yeah, and that was one of the main parts of my journey as well, is actually sitting down and reading the Gospels and thinking, wow, why was I skipping over those? And I remember back in my reformed conservative days, doing my Bible reading and hurrying up to get over the Gospels to get to Paul. Because Paul I could really get to fit my agenda of justification by faith and grace and all of that I thought was the main thing, all the doctrine, all the theology, and I found Jesus hard to understand, a little uncomfortable. But when I actually sat down to read the Gospels, wow, why is there this disconnect? So that's a really good point.
Well, I just have thoughts going around how it seems like the conservative, maybe it's political, they seem to want prayer in schools, and they deny that they're creationists, and which means might makes right, sort of, which I think that supports war. As where Jesus says, love your enemies and help the poor, feed those who are hungry. That's so different than, and it seems like the evangelicals, they join in, they're sort of schizophrenic, saying that they don't believe in, they do believe in six-day, whatever, the creation. And then they actually believe in might makes right, or the survival of the fittest. You can go and just cream anybody along your way and get your corporation it doesn't matter with the morals of your corporation. You just trample over people who use them. Walmart makes, you know, tiny wages, and you know, who cares about everybody else?
Yeah.
It's just like schizophrenic.
And it's rooted in the not being Jesus-focused for so long. And this brother over here, Dwayne Beachy, actually just wrote a really great book I want to help promote. It's called Reading the Bible as If Jesus Mattered. And it's really, I resonated with it. I endorsed it because it's what is happening in young evangelicals. When you begin to understand, and this is a huge movement, and it's really good news for all of us, that young evangelicals in particular, not to exclude older ones as well, are starting to realize that if we use Paul as an interpretive grid for the rest of the Bible, you can justify a lot of stuff, from slavery to war. I sat down with one of the leading theologians, Wayne Grudem, in evangelicalism, wrote a big book on systematic theology, and he talked to me for 45 minutes about this complex just war theory and why it was so essential to his faith, and as a follower of Jesus, we needed to be about this. And this was at a period when I was starting to rediscover Jesus, and it just, the video has resonated negatively with a lot of young evangelicals because it's just ridiculous. You cannot look at Jesus and then say it's okay to go to war. And so I think there is a real movement to refocus on Jesus among young evangelicals that's really hope-inspiring. So.
Yeah, it's just the disruption of the system, right? The system has to be disrupted just a little bit, so we feel a little bit uncomfortable in our system, and then we go back to read Jesus and think, wow, like this sounds like gospel. Like loving your enemies sounds like gospel. And
It is.
this other system is maybe more complex than I thought.
Well, I also think that lots of young people aren't able to get jobs now, and they see that their parents, who are sort of saying, you know, keep low wages, Christians, you know, keeping the low wages, that doesn't feel too good. You know, there's going to be a pushback, maybe just out of reality.
Yeah. And praise God for that.
And the point of the book that I wrote isn't Jesus against Paul. It's just that you need to read Jesus first and understand Paul in light of what Jesus said, rather than what most people do, which is read Paul first and then understand Jesus in light of what Paul said. You know, so it's just which it becomes your hermeneutic center.
Yeah.
And I think Jesus has to be the hermeneutic
If
center.
there's
I
such
have copies here if anybody wants. It's on Amazon and you can buy. I mean, it's not ready to order yet, so it's just coming out. But I have copies here if anybody wants.
Please
to buy
do buy it. Actually, that's not just a shameless promotion.
Yeah,
it's really great.
in there,
But yeah, and that's all rooted in the theological, like, and this is what has been so profound for me, is realizing the gospel is much better news than I thought it was. Because when the gospel is all about right believing to be justified by some cosmic transaction that happened on the cross between God killing his son, if that's the gospel, then Jesus' message doesn't make sense, and it makes you uncomfortable because he says things like, those who didn't feed me when I was poor, they're going to be cast into the lake of fire. Now, no matter what you believe about hell, that's still uncomfortable, and it doesn't align up with the gospel as we understand it through Paul. And so it's essential to read Paul through the lens of Jesus, just to say that. So I've seen you raise your hand.
So I'm not an evangelical. I never have identified as an evangelical. I'm actually a member of the United Methodist Church. And we're wrestling with a lot of these same issues. When you look at where the Methodist Church started with John Wesley, there was a distinct proclamation in response to Calvin in the early days about God's preference for all people. And yet, having grown up in the South as a United Methodist and then moving north and being in seminary, I kind of have got a different picture painted of Wesley's faith and of the Methodist faith, the global Methodist Church, not just the United Methodist Church in America or in the southern United States. My question goes back to your original question or my thought. So I'm still in the United Methodist Church. I'm not planning on leaving the United Methodist Church anytime soon because I believe in our roots and I believe in where we started. There were many people in the Methodist Church back in the day that helped to make sure that people that looked like me were free and not enslaved. And so I'm wondering, when you talk about saying that it needs to die, and I'm not sure whether or not I agree or disagree with you, is it death and resurrection back to your original roots and replacing it with what the evangelical faith started with? Or is it something new? Like where, I'm not sure where if you're going to say that it needs to die, then what are you seeking to replace it with? Like a restart or something altogether different?
It's a legitimate question. So back when I started the Revangelical Movement, I gave us a list. I wrote up a list of 11 things that I think our generation, Revangelicals, are going to be about. And the first one is rooted religion. What's not happening is that a new generation is arrogantly cutting themselves off from older generation and traditions of faith and trying to go be this new innovative Christian type thing. In fact, what we see in the millennial generation is we're all returning to liturgical ancient practices, ancient versions of faith. And so when I'm talking about the evangelical, SS evangelical dying, I'm talking about the structure of the National Association of Evangelicals, the Gospel Coalition, this thing that's been formed and has hijacked this name of evangelicalism. What we are going to return to, I don't think, so Martin Luther is actually the guy who's attributed with the word evangelical. I don't think we're going to all return to a Lutheran foundation. In fact, I think what we're going to see is a more interspiritual foundation. We're going to see Catholic-type practices and Orthodox practices kind of integrated because we're very interested in that, and we're an attention deficit generation, so we don't focus on one tradition long enough. So all that to say, I think what's happening is we're going to re-root ourselves. A lot of us are mystified by the Catholic Church right now, and we love the creeds, and we're getting into the Church Fathers. But, as Rob Bell has actually said in his new book, God is also calling us forward into a new expression of faith as well. And so we're reaching backwards and holding on, but also stretching forward into something brand new. And so what's going to emerge, Lord willing, in the coming years is going to be something new, and I think it's not just happening in evangelicalism, it's going to be in the Catholic Church and the mainline church, and I think we're, Lord willing, also going to be able to dialogue a lot more with one another when these new expressions do emerge, because they're so reliant on each other. Yeah.
I think you had a point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to address what you're talking about because I feel like I have struggled with the word evangelical and evangelicalism, particularly in the last year. I grew up as an Episcopalian. I'm still a practicing Episcopalian, and we don't use that word very often. But in the last year, I feel like I have embraced it more as I realize that the word itself means good news in Greek, and we get the word gospel from the Old English for good news, right? And so I feel as though what you just said with the word has been hijacked. It has, and I'm not willing to see the word die. I'd like to think that you can spread good news without oppressive proselytization. The word is not synonymous with oppressive interpretations of the Bible. And so I feel comfortable at this point saying I'd like to revive evangelicalism, but in a different practice, and I consider myself an evangelical.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And that's what needs to happen. There's two things that happen when you say the word evangelical. One, people like me have PTSD and are going to freak out with it because it reminds us of terrible things that happen. And so for those people, I do think there's going to be a need to abandon the word. There's no need to be a part of a movement that brings death instead of life to you. But with people like you embracing the word evangelical, and even tons of Catholics are embracing the word evangelical, that is, if you can stand up in a context and say, I'm an evangelical Christian, and I don't hate gay people, and I'm not a Tea Party Republican, and I don't, then you're going to start really causing some brain, I don't even know what to call it, in people's minds, and that's going to be amazing. That's what's going to change.
I'm from South Carolina, and I've spent a lot of time in close quarters with Bob Jones University.
Yeah.
And
God bless
it's
you.
taken a lot for me to come around and say, I am an evangelical
Yeah.
Christian.
And with that,
I'm not willing to let them claim the word.
Yeah.
It's powerful.
And,
Thank you.
and continue to love those who do claim it wrongly and represent yourself to them, because then people like me at Moody need people like you and say, wow, I can be an evangelical, retain that, and be something different. So.
Yeah, you talk maybe a little bit about the sort of your re-evangelical group in terms of its interest in politics, the new generation in terms of its political connection. Evangelicals have been sort of generally associated with the right, Republicans, sort of used to sort of throw rocks, at that side of the that side of the political spectrum. And in here, I hear a lot of, lot of interest in Wild Goose and sort of the left and Democratic left. Nevertheless, when we get back to Jesus, as I read him in the Gospel, he's pretty apolitical and seems to try to remove himself from the political context. But that conundrum of being engaged or not, is the new evangelical movement going to, as the moral majority, associate itself with the right? Is this new movement going to just go to the left?
Yeah.
And make some of the same mistakes, and gets caught up in a political movement that they should have avoided?
I think, yes, some people will do that. That's always going to happen in any spiritual, religious movement, in America at least. But the two emerging trends I see, I'm getting involved personally in political work. It has nothing to do with me being an evangelical, and I do happen to be Democratic. But what's not happening with evangelicals is they jump from right to left. It's definitely, all these movements are coming up with a moderate position politically, because I identify as pro-life, but I'm also pro-gay marriage, and we're rereading Jesus, reinterpreting the Bible for a new age. But also, a really interesting trend that I think actually has more life to it, potentially, and that I will probably end up in, is political disengagement, which scares some people, but there's been big movements with people like Shane Claiborne, who have talked about we live simultaneously in the kingdom of God and in the kingdom of this world, and the way we're going to subvert the kingdom of this world is by, at a grassroots level, subversively loving people and engaging in justice at home, and it's not going to be accomplished through Washington. And I think a lot of us are really burnt out and cynical with politics as well, and so we're going to engage on changing the world down here, but also I think it's important to realize that politics do matter in some areas, and we need to work on that. So no, we're not all just becoming a religious left. I don't think the way...
Something very practical, but it's going to require God's Spirit in people, is we have to get away from the idea that everything outside of evangelicalism is tainted and can't possibly be any good, meaning institutions, meaning arts, meaning special people. We've got this, in some places it's actually taught, but there's this undercurrent that seeps into us that you really can't be a real friend to somebody outside the church because they're not saved and they don't believe the way we do. So they end up becoming targets to what we think the gospel is, instead of our looking for God in every place. I mean, when you cannot see God in something, know that God is everywhere in something. And you just need to be looking. And we have this, we built this stockade around us, and people outside are saying, okay, you want to be there, they're snapping the padlock on us from the outside. Because we have become toxic to them. Rather than being salt and light, become poisonous.
For sure.
We need to realize that we can have friends who are pre-believers. We can be vulnerable with them. Just as, we're willing to maybe accept that they can be vulnerable with us, because after all, the Spirit's moving in them. But are we willing to accept their help, their love? Are we willing to maybe share our problems with them? Christians don't have problems. We're supposed to have the solution. But when you meet with people at that level, they are able to see Jesus.
And I don't want to be overly idealistic, but I would say two things about the millennial generation. One, most interconnected generation because of social media and things like that. So we're exposed to all these belief systems. I went to school, my best friends were Muslim and Mormon, and so we're willing to look for God in other places, even as distinctly evangelical people. And then I forgot the second thing, so yeah.
I came out of a immigrant Reformed church, and I think about 40 or 50 years ago, they decided they were like evangelicals because we believe in the gospel, conversions, and missionaries and stuff. But I've never really identified myself as an evangelical, and so I don't have that sense of identity crisis. If I'm not, I was thought it was evangelical, I think, but Americans. And maybe Methodists are like that, and we weren't. And I feel like it's a whole historical movement to distinguish themselves from liberals who sort of give it up on Christ. And meanwhile, I've become connected with Catholics I knew who are really Christ believers.
Yeah.
And Mennonites who are Christ believers. So I recognize your identity crisis, but I also think you're on the right track by saying you don't have to hang on to this because it's a historical thing that try to get us back to the gospel. But it is a problem because over the years you built up a circle of trust of theologians you believe in struggle for issues. Now where do you go? You can't trust just evangelical. You got to sort of build the circle of theologians, writers, and thinkers who establish kind of creed that you feel comfortable to work out of. But that's good because I think we've learned in the last 3 or 4 years, we've learned a lot about the historical background of the New Testament. We've learned a lot about Gospels. We are grown as a Church of Christ theologically. But how do we, with that, how do we reconnect with all those Christians who are right? And together, because you talk in right companies and why we too have my nation. Yes. And learn from and trust us. So it seems like you have to build a new core Christ.
And I think Wild Goose is a small glimpse of that. That we have this, I mean, who would have thought that a Moody Bible Institute graduate could sit here at Wild Goose and talk, and yet they let me. And there's people here who can scantily call themselves Christians and would be okay with that. And we're bringing together all these voices, and it's very helpful to all of our faith, this eclectic spirituality. But I also think I understand the point of holding on to a tradition and title, because the other thing is you don't want to be, millennials really struggle with feeling not having a tradition, being disconnected from everything. Our families didn't have, I didn't grow up with family dinners and things like that, just a very kind of common traditional American thing, so I feel very aloof from all tradition. And so there is part of me that distinctly wants to claim a title and say, I am an evangelical, and identify with that tradition, good and bad, and I'm working to make it better. But I totally get what you're saying, and we need to work on eclectic spirituality, for sure.
Yeah, so maybe we need to build, like what you're doing is build some new connections.
Absolutely. Well, thank you.
Okay. Would you still recommend leaving evangelicalism, still knowing that they might lose their faith altogether?
That's a hard question. I think, one, the journey, this is where the evangelical inside of me comes out. People who leave the faith, I'm confident, will find a form of faith that will give them life. I don't think God's going to let people go, if that makes sense. And so I think people need to go on their journey, and people are going to need to leave evangelicalism, and some of them are going to lose their faith, and that's okay for them. But if evangelicalism is toxic to them, if it's harmful for them, if you exist in an environment like a Moody or something like that, and you're LGBT, I would say you probably should leave, because right now it's not a healthy environment for you at all. And it's not going to be a healthy environment for a few more years. There are people like Matthew Vines who are working on trying to reform evangelicalism in that regard. But there are some people who just need to find a new tradition. And that sounds terrible, but it's for their own health, because with Al Mohlers and these big gospel coalition leaders, some of them are very destructive and harmful. So if that answered that at all, yeah.
Then we got time for like one or two more, I think.
Yeah, it seems to me that conservative power brokers have kind of turned their sights away from core issues that evangelicals care about. They're now focused on libertarian type, small government, anti-healthcare guns, those sorts of things. You think evangelicals are going to be abandoned in some sense, and that might kind of stir the pot in terms of rehumanizing?
If I understand you correctly, I would definitely say yes, and I would want to give this to all of you who aren't evangelicals or are progressive. Give conservative evangelicals a lot of grace, because what happens is when they For instance, just to use an example, the street preacher that was outside yesterday, I don't know if he was an evangelical, but we'll use him as an